In 1912, workers digging beneath the Vanderbilt family's Fifth Avenue mansion made a discovery that would never appear in any newspaper. No headline announced what they found. No photograph captured the moment. And for over a century, what lay beneath one of America's most famous addresses remained buried under layers of silence, money, and careful misdirection. The date was March 17th, 1912, a Sunday. The construction crew wasn't supposed to be working, but deadlines were tight, and the Vanderbilt estate manager had authorized overtime at double the normal rate. 7 men descended into the foundation excavation armed with pickaxes, shovels, and kerosene lanterns. Their task appeared straightforward: shore up the northeastern corner where engineers had detected settling that threatened the mansion's structural integrity. What they found, instead, would haunt 3 of those 7 men for the rest of their lives. The other 4 took their silence to the grave, either by choice or by pressure. We can only speculate about today. But the 3 who talked, even in hushed conversations with family decades later, painted a picture of something that shouldn't have existed beneath a private residence, something that revealed the true nature of how concentrated wealth operated in America's Gilded Age. The Vanderbilt name represented American success in its purest form. Cornelius Vanderbilt had turned steamships and railroads into a fortune that dominated an entire era. By 1912, his descendants controlled wealth conservatively estimated at over $200 million. In today's purchasing power, that fortune would equal somewhere between $300 and $500 billion. Not millions, billions. A level of wealth concentration that made them effectively sovereign within the American economic system. But that wealth came with secrets. Secrets about how it was really accumulated. Secrets about what happened to competitors. Secrets about infrastructure built not for public benefit, but for private control. And some of those secrets were quite literally underground, built into the foundation of America's most ostentatious display of Gilded Age excess at 640 Fifth Avenue. The official story was simple. The mansion needed repairs. Standard maintenance for a structure that size. Workers went down with shovels and came back up with dirt. Nothing unusual. But 3 construction workers told a vastly different story. They spoke of tunnels, of finished rooms that shouldn't exist beneath a private home, of infrastructure built for purposes that made no architectural sense. They spoke of discovery, of orders to stay silent, of payments that seemed designed to buy discretion rather than compensate labor. And they spoke of being genuinely frightened, not of physical danger or collapse, frightened of what the discovery meant, frightened of who had built it and why, frightened of the implications if what lay beneath the Vanderbilt mansion was replicated beneath other great houses. Understanding what was found requires understanding what the Vanderbilts actually did with their money. The popular narrative paints them as railroad barons who built American infrastructure and created jobs. That narrative carefully omits certain details about how they built those fortunes, the specific methods they employed, and most importantly, where the money actually went. Cornelius Vanderbilt didn't invent railroads or steamships. What he perfected was something far more valuable, the art of monopoly through strategic destruction. His approach was elegant in its brutality. The strategy worked like this: identify a market with multiple competitors. Enter that market not to compete, but to dominate. Buy up competing operations. Then systematically destroy the competitors you didn't buy, not by outcompeting them through better service or innovation, but by making their operations literally impossible to conduct. In the 1860s, Vanderbilt gained control of the New York Central Railroad. Within months, every competing line faced mysterious catastrophes: equipment failures at precisely the worst moments, sudden labor shortages when workers were offered higher wages to abandon their posts, inexplicable accidents that shut down operations for weeks at critical times, bridges collapsed on competing routes, telegraph lines serving rival companies went dead when communication would have prevented disaster. Freight mysteriously arrived, damaged, or didn't arrive at all, devastating businesses that depended on those competitor lines. Customers who used competing railroads found their shipments delayed, misdirected, or lost entirely. The pattern repeated across every market Vanderbilt entered: steamship lines, ferry services, railroad routes from New York to Chicago, and the pattern left a paper trail, though not in newspapers or public records. That trail existed in private correspondence, in account books that never made it to public filings, in testimony from workers who suddenly found themselves unemployed when they asked too many questions. By 1877, when Cornelius Vanderbilt died, he'd accumulated over $100 million. To put that in perspective, the entire United States government's annual budget in 1877 was less than $250 million. One man controlled wealth equivalent to nearly half the federal budget. That's not entrepreneurship. That's systematic extraction through methods that would be prosecuted as organized crime if anyone without that much money had attempted them. The system continued under his son, William Henry Vanderbilt. William proved even more ruthless, if less flamboyant. Where Cornelius had been loud and openly contemptuous of public opinion, William operated with cold calculation. He understood something his father had only grasped intuitively. The real power wasn't in owning the railroads. It was in controlling the financial mechanisms that decided which railroads succeeded and which failed. William pioneered what we'd now recognize as financial engineering. He created holding companies that owned other holding companies in nested structures that made actual ownership nearly impossible to trace. He structured debt in ways that let the Vanderbilts profit regardless of whether trains ran successfully or not. He manipulated stock prices through carefully timed information releases to financial journalists who were either on his payroll or dependent on his cooperation. He understood leverage before the term entered common vocabulary. Controlling critical infrastructure nodes gave him power far beyond simple ownership. If you controlled the rail bridge across the Hudson River, you didn't need to own every rail line. You just charged whatever fees the market would bear. If competitors complained, they could build their own bridge. Except regulatory capture meant permits for competing bridges were mysteriously delayed or denied. William turned the railroad business from transportation into financial extraction. Stock watering was refined to an art form. Assets would be valued at 5 times their actual worth. Stock issued based on inflated valuations, and investors would buy shares thinking they were getting legitimate equity when they were funding the family's consolidation of power. This is where revisionist economic history becomes necessary. The standard telling claims the Vanderbilts built American infrastructure, but closer examination reveals they built a control system disguised as infrastructure. Railways didn't just move goods and people, they moved capital. They created winners and losers in real estate markets by determining which towns got rail access. They decided which industries could ship affordably. They determined which cities grew and which withered. And the Vanderbilts could determine all these outcomes before anyone else even knew the decisions were being made. William Henry Vanderbilt famously told a reporter in 1882, "The public be damned, I'm working for my stockholders." The quote scandalized newspapers, but it revealed the operating philosophy. The public wasn't the customer. The public was the resource being harvested. Between 1877 and 1885, William doubled the family fortune from 100 million to over 200 million, not through innovation, through manipulation of freight rates, strategic bankruptcies of competing lines, and financial instruments we'd recognize as derivatives trading. That fortune needed somewhere to go. Some went into the mansion at 640 Fifth Avenue. Construction began in 1879 and finished in 1882. The public cost was reported as $3 million, an astronomical sum that would equal nearly 100 million today. But 3 million was merely the official number. The actual expenditure was never disclosed, and for good reason. The mansion was designed as a statement. 137 rooms spread across 4 floors occupying an entire Manhattan block. Marble imported from Carrara, Italy. Woodwork carved by European craftsmen. Art collections worth millions more. Every surface chosen to communicate one message. The Vanderbilts existed on a different plane from ordinary humanity. But the real investment wasn't in what visitors could see. The foundation went far deeper than necessary. Workers excavated 40 feet down in some places, when 20 would have been sufficient, even accounting for Manhattan's uneven bedrock. The official explanation was stability. The Vanderbilts were building for generations, but experienced builders questioned the excessive depth, some openly, most quietly. Those who questioned too loudly found work difficult to secure afterward. Word spread, don't ask uncomfortable questions about projects for the extremely wealthy. What was built in that excessive depth became clear only to a select few. The mansion featured a coal delivery system, as all large homes did. Coal came in through street-level chutes and was stored in basement bunkers. But the coal bunkers at 645th Avenue connected to chambers that extended far beyond the property line. Not by a few feet, by dozens of yards, running under the street itself and connecting to adjacent properties in ways that violated every building code and property law. This wasn't discovered immediately upon completion. The original workers who built these features during the 1879 to 1882 construction period were sworn to strict secrecy through employment contracts that threatened ruinous legal consequences for any disclosure. Many of those workers were immigrants who understood that speaking out would mean not just losing their jobs, but facing potential deportation or blacklisting that would make employment anywhere in New York impossible. The secret held remarkably well for 3 full decades. It only came to light in 1912 during those supposedly routine foundation repairs. The work crew was excavating near what they believed was a solid exterior foundation wall on the northeastern corner. They'd been told to dig down, expose the foundation, examine it for cracks or settling, and report back to the supervising engineer. Standard procedure for addressing structural concerns in a building that age. Thomas Brennan, the crew foreman, was the first to break through. His pickaxe went through what should have been solid rock fill and instead met empty air. The workers gathered around the opening and shone their kerosene lanterns into the darkness beyond. What they saw was a finished brick-lined passage with professional masonry work, not rough stone or packed earth. Carefully laid brick in running bond pattern, the kind of work that takes skill and time. They widened the breach so they could all enter. The tunnel was approximately 8 feet high and 6 feet wide, large enough for a grown man to walk through upright, large enough for wheeled carts. The walls were professionally finished brickwork. The ceiling was arched in classic barrel vault style. The floor showed significant wear patterns. Deep grooves ran along the center, parallel tracks created by heavy-wheeled vehicles being rolled repeatedly over many years. And most surprising, electric lighting fixtures mounted along the walls at regular intervals. Not gas lamps, electric bulbs in protective housings connected to copper wiring. One of the workers tested a switch, and the bulbs illuminated, still drawing power after all these years. The tunnel ran east from the mansion toward the interior of the block. They followed it for approximately 30 yards before reaching the first side chamber. Heavy iron doors set into brick frames. The doors were closed but not locked. Inside each chamber was a room roughly 10 by 12 feet, empty now but showing clear evidence of past use. Mounting brackets were bolted to the walls for shelving or storage racks. The ventilation was sophisticated, with intake and exhaust shafts, and the locks were on the outside of the doors, suggesting whatever these rooms stored was meant to be secured from unauthorized access. When they emerged and reported what they'd found to the site supervisor, his reaction was immediate. He told them to stop work and wait. Within 2 hours, men in expensive suits arrived, not architects or engineers. These men had the bearing of lawyers or executives. The conversations followed a pattern. Questions about exactly what they'd seen, then an offer. A significant bonus payment, several months' wages, in exchange for signing a legal document. The message was clear. Discuss what you've seen and face legal action that will financially destroy you. Most workers signed immediately. 3 hesitated and were called back for a second conversation. This time the tone was different. Less friendly, more specific about consequences. Not just legal action, but difficulty finding work. Accidents could happen on construction sites. All 7 eventually signed and received their payments. Within a week, a different crew arrived to seal the tunnel, not the regular construction company. a specialized crew who worked quickly and with absolute discretion. The tunnel entrance was filled with concrete, making it as if the passage had never existed. 3 of those workers eventually talked, though not for years. Not to newspapers, which wouldn't have published such allegations, but to family members, to friends in labour organisations, to other construction workers who had seen similar features on other projects. And slowly, a pattern emerged. The richest families in New York had built an underground infrastructure that mirrored the one above ground. Tunnels connecting properties, storage chambers built far beyond any legitimate need, ventilation and lighting systems indicating regular use. And they'd done it in plain sight, hidden beneath mundane explanations of coal storage and foundation work that no one questioned. What was that infrastructure for? The answer requires understanding the financial panic of 1907. That panic revealed vulnerabilities the extremely wealthy found absolutely intolerable. It showed that even massive fortunes remained vulnerable to forces outside their direct control. The panic began in October 1907 when the Knickerbocker Trust Company collapsed. The failure triggered immediate runs on other banks and trust companies. Depositors rushed to withdraw their money. The banks didn't have enough physical currency to meet all withdrawal demands simultaneously. Within days, several major financial institutions had failed. Fortunes that existed as bank deposits and paper assets evaporated overnight. Wealthy families who kept assets in what they thought were the safest institutions suddenly couldn't access their own money. Some faced genuine possibility of ruin, not because their wealth had vanished, but because it was locked inside systems that had ceased to function. The psychological impact was profound. These families had believed their wealth made them immune to economic forces affecting ordinary people. The panic taught them otherwise. Traditional banking systems, no matter how prestigious, could fail. Government might intervene in ways that froze assets. Angry mobs, seeing their own savings disappear, might target the visibly wealthy. The panic revealed something that truly alarmed the richest families. They didn't have as much control as they'd assumed. J.P. Morgan organized a private rescue of the financial system, but it took weeks of frantic coordination. For that period, the stability of American finance depended on one man's reputation and willingness to risk his fortune. The wealthy learned several uncomfortable lessons. Paper wealth could become worthless. Traditional financial institutions were vulnerable to runs and failures. Government intervention might freeze assets or limit access. And public anger during economic distress might manifest as violence against visible symbols of wealth. The solution was to create parallel systems where wealth could be held and moved outside traditional banking channels. Gold became the primary mechanism. Paper money remained vulnerable to government decree or economic collapse. Bank deposits could be frozen. Stock certificates were just paper that could become worthless. But gold was different. Gold held value independent of any government's decisions. It was recognized and accepted everywhere. It couldn't be devalued by printing more. And critically, physical possession of gold meant true ownership in a way bank deposits or stock certificates never could. The problem was transportation and storage. $1 million in gold at 1907 prices weighed approximately 1,550 pounds. $10 million weighed over 7 tons. Moving that kind of weight through New York streets during times of panic was effectively impossible without attracting dangerous attention. Armed guards were no solution. They could be overwhelmed by determined mobs. Regular transportation routes could be blocked by protests or riots. Government authorities might stop shipments for taxation purposes. Every surface route created vulnerability and exposure. The Vanderbilt tunnel system, discovered in 1912, was part of this larger network. Other construction projects revealed similar features. The Astor Mansion showed foundation work far deeper than required. The Carnegie residence had ventilation systems serving spaces not shown on official plans. The Morgan townhouse had coal delivery systems connecting to chambers extending beyond property boundaries, all built during the same period, 1880 to 1900. All featuring the same questionable choices that made sense only as nodes in a coordinated system. The discovery in 1912 was particularly sensitive because of timing. That year saw the beginning of serious congressional investigations into financial power concentration. The Pujo Committee hearings would expose how a tiny group effectively controlled American banking. The last thing those men needed was physical evidence of secret infrastructure built to circumvent normal financial systems. The response was swift. The tunnel beneath the Vanderbilt mansion was filled with concrete within 1 week. Not just blocked, completely filled. Workers were paid generously and asked to sign legal agreements backed by threats of litigation. Building permits that might have revealed original construction details disappeared from city archives, and anyone who pressed for information faced legal threats or worse. But the story didn't die completely. It circulated in labor circles. It became one of those things construction workers knew about but didn't discuss openly. Some families kept documents. Photographs that weren't supposed to exist, payroll records showing men were paid for work with no official purpose. One such document appeared in a probate case in 1967. A construction foreman who worked on the 1912 repairs had kept a journal. His grandson tried to donate it to the New York Historical Society. The journal contained detailed entries about the tunnel discovery, including sketches of the layout. The Historical Society declined the donation, not because they doubted its authenticity, because accepting it would require acknowledging what it represented. That journal still exists in a private collection. The entries describe a tunnel roughly 8 feet high and 6 feet wide, brick-lined with arched ceilings, electric lighting that still functioned in 1912, and most revealing, marks on the floor suggesting heavy carts had been rolled through repeatedly over years. The journal also noted chambers branching off the main tunnel, small rooms perhaps 10 by 12 feet, with heavy iron doors. These rooms were empty when discovered, but they showed clear signs of use, mounting brackets on the walls, ventilation systems sophisticated for the era, and locks on the outside of the doors suggesting whatever was stored there was meant to stay secured. Gold wasn't the only thing needing protection. Records also required safekeeping. The paper trail of how wealth was accumulated needed to be preserved for the families, but kept from public scrutiny. In an era before safety deposit boxes were common, before bank vaults were truly secure, private storage in locations controlled entirely by the families made sense. The tunnel system provided that control. The revisionist economic history matters because it challenges the fundamental narrative of American wealth creation. The story we're taught is one of innovation, risk-taking, and value creation. The story revealed by what was found beneath the Vanderbilt mansion is different. It's a story of control systems, of infrastructure, built not for public good but for private protection, of wealth that needed to hide from both the public and the government. This wasn't capitalism as it's typically defended. This was something else, a private financial system running parallel to the public one. A system where the rules that apply to everyone else simply didn't apply, where wealth could be moved, hidden and protected, using infrastructure that technically didn't exist. The question becomes, why go to such lengths? The answer lies in what happened when they didn't. The period from 1890 to 1920 saw numerous attempts at wealth taxation, antitrust enforcement and financial regulation. The wealthy families fought these efforts publicly through legal and political means, but they also prepared privately for the possibility that public resistance would fail. The tunnel systems were part of that preparation. By the time the tunnels were discovered and filled, the need for them had largely passed. The Federal Reserve System, established in 1913, created new mechanisms for wealth protection. The Income Tax Amendment, ratified the same year, created a system where wealthy families could use legal structures to minimize obligations rather than requiring physical hiding places. But the tunnels represented something important about how wealth operates at a certain scale. It creates its own infrastructure, it writes its own rules, and it builds systems that exist in the shadows of public institutions, neither fully visible nor completely hidden. The Vanderbilt mansion was demolished in 1927. The family had moved on. The land was worth more than the building, and perhaps most importantly, the foundation had served its purpose. When workers demolished the structure, they found the coal bunkers filled with concrete. The tunnel entrances had been thoroughly sealed. The evidence had been erased as completely as possible. But erasure isn't elimination. Stories persist, documents survive, and occasionally during construction projects in that area, workers still find things that don't make architectural sense. Brick walls where there should be bedrock, ventilation shafts serving no existing structure, mysteries that are carefully noted, quietly filled, and never officially explained. The broader system represented by those tunnels continued in other forms: Swiss bank accounts, offshore tax havens, shell corporations. The mechanisms evolved, but the principle remained. Wealth above a certain threshold requires infrastructure outside normal systems. The Vanderbilt tunnels were just one early physical manifestation. What makes this revisionist history rather than conspiracy theory is the evidence. Construction records that exist show expenditures that don't match visible results. Testimony from workers, while scattered, follows consistent patterns. Architectural features, when examined by modern engineers, reveal design choices that only make sense if structures had purposes beyond official functions. And the response to discovery tells its own story. When the tunnels were found, the reaction wasn't confusion or surprise. It was immediate, coordinated action to conceal and eliminate. That reaction only makes sense if what was found was exactly what was supposed to be there, a planned, intentional system that couldn't be publicly acknowledged. The legacy of what was found under the Vanderbilt mansion extends beyond one family's secrets. It raises questions about how wealth operates at the highest levels, about what infrastructure exists that we don't see, about systems built not through public processes but through private decisions by those with sufficient resources to build their own reality. The modern financial system is vastly more complex than in 1912. Wealth moves electronically rather than through physical tunnels. But the principle remains. At certain levels of wealth, the rules governing everyone else become optional. Systems can be built privately. Infrastructure can exist in shadows. And when that infrastructure is discovered, the response is not explanation, but elimination of evidence. The workers who discovered the Vanderbilt tunnels understood they'd found something significant. They also understood that significance made them vulnerable. Most stayed quiet. Those who didn't face consequences that made silence seem wise, and the tunnel was filled, the records destroyed, the story buried under concrete and careful forgetting. But stories survive. They circulate in diminished form. They become rumors that everyone knows but no one can prove. And occasionally, when evidence surfaces or enough time passes, they become something more. Not quite history because they lack full documentation, but not myth either, because too many pieces fit together too well. What was found under the Vanderbilt mansion matters because it reveals how power actually operates, not through public institutions and formal processes, but through private systems built by those with resources sufficient to create their own rules. The tunnel was just infrastructure, but it represented a principle, and that principle shaped American economic development in ways official histories carefully omit. The Vanderbilts are gone now, the mansion demolished a century ago, the tunnels filled and forgotten. But the questions remain. What other infrastructure exists that we don't see? What systems operate in shadows? And what would we find beneath other monuments to great wealth? Those questions force examination of assumptions about how American prosperity was built and who benefited. They suggest the official story omits as much as it reveals, and they remind us that what's buried often matters as much as what stands visible. The discovery in 1912 was promptly covered up, but the evidence of that cover-up survived. And that evidence tells us how systems of power operate when they think no one is watching, and how quickly they move to eliminate evidence when someone does.